Raymond Foster's hands were still dusty from fixing his neighbor's broken fence when she handed him her business card. The young woman had watched him work for 3 hours, measuring angles twice, reinforcing corners that didn't need it, calculating weight distribution like he was designing a bridge, not repairing wood slats. She'd asked quiet questions about his technique, his past, why someone with an engineer's precision was doing handyman work on a Saturday afternoon. He'd brushed it off, said he just liked things done right. But when he glanced at the card in his truck, Allison Reed, Chief Executive Officer, Reed Enterprises, his hands froze on the steering wheel. He didn't know Reed Enterprises owned 15 commercial buildings downtown. He didn't know his simple act of neighborly kindness had just put him in front of the woman who controlled half the town's real estate. And he had no idea that 1 week later, this woman would make him an offer that forced him to face the hardest choice of his life: hold on to the safe life he'd built for his son, or awaken the dream he'd buried with his grief 3 years ago. What came next would force him to answer the question he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Could a single father find the courage to believe in himself again? The morning had started like any other Saturday. Raymond woke at 6:30, made scrambled eggs and toast for Caleb, his 7-year-old son. Sunlight filtered through their small kitchen window, casting soft shadows across the worn wooden table. Caleb ate slowly, his small fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on his glass of orange juice. He looked up at his father with those serious brown eyes that always made Raymond's chest tighten with love and responsibility. The weight of being both mother and father pressed down on him every morning, but he carried it willingly. After breakfast, Raymond drove Caleb to his friend's house for a play date. The boy chattered about school, about the tower he was building with blocks, about how his teacher said he was good at math. Raymond listened with half his attention on the road, half on his son's voice. It was these moments he lived for now, the ordinary ones, the safe ones. 3 years ago, he'd learned how quickly ordinary could shatter. One moment of inattention on a rainy highway, and his wife was gone. He'd been at work, sketching elevation drawings for a downtown high-rise, when the call came. The career he'd spent 8 years building suddenly meant nothing compared to the terrified little boy who needed him. So Raymond had walked away from architecture. He'd taken a job as a building maintenance worker, fixing leaky faucets and replacing light bulbs in apartment complexes. The pay was less than half what he'd earned, but the hours were predictable. He could drop Caleb at school, work his shift, and be home for dinner every single night. On weekends, he did odd jobs around the neighborhood, painting fences, repairing decks, installing ceiling fans. It wasn't the career he'd imagined, but it was enough. It had to be enough. That afternoon, driving back from Caleb's playdate, Raymond noticed the fence. His new neighbor's property line ran along the sidewalk, and last night's storm had knocked down a section of weathered boards. The young woman who lived there stood on her porch, staring at the damage with her arms crossed. Raymond had seen her around. She kept to herself, drove a modest sedan, dressed in simple jeans and sweaters. She'd moved in 2 months ago and barely spoke to anyone on the block. The other neighbors speculated she was unemployed, or maybe working from home. No one really knew. Raymond pulled over without thinking. It was what neighbors did for each other, especially in their small community, where people still looked out for one another. He grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed and walked across her lawn. The grass needed mowing, he noticed. The gutters could use cleaning too. She turned as he approached, surprise crossing her features. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp, observant eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He introduced himself, offered to fix the fence. She hesitated, then accepted with quiet gratitude. Her name was Allison, she said. Just Allison. Raymond set to work, pulling out the damaged boards, measuring the gaps with the same precision he'd once used to design load-bearing walls. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory from years of training taking over. He reinforced the posts, added diagonal bracing that wasn't strictly necessary, but would help the fence survive the next storm. It was how his mind worked. He couldn't help but improve on the original design. Allison brought him lemonade an hour into the work. She stood at a careful distance, watching his hands as they measured and cut and hammered. Her gaze felt different from the casual observation of most clients. It was analytical, measuring not just the work, but the worker himself. She asked about his technique, why he was reinforcing the corners, how he calculated the stress points. Her questions were too specific, too informed. This wasn't someone making small talk. This was someone who understood structural engineering. Raymond deflected with jokes and half-answers. He didn't talk about his past anymore, about the designs that had won state awards, about the career he'd abandoned. That life belonged to someone else, someone who'd existed before tragedy had reshaped him. Now he was just a handyman, a single father trying to give his son stability. That was enough. It had to be enough. He repeated that phrase to himself often, like a mantra against the ache of unfulfilled dreams. By 3 in the afternoon, the fence stood straight and strong. Raymond gathered his tools, declined payment with a wave of his hand. Allison disappeared into her house and returned with a business card. "Take it anyway," she said, "in case you ever need anything." He glanced at it quickly, thanked her, and left. It wasn't until he was sitting in his truck, Caleb buckled in beside him, that he really looked at the card. The words hit him like cold water. Allison Reed, Chief Executive Officer, Reed Enterprises. His hands went still on the steering wheel. Reed Enterprises. He knew that name. Everyone in town knew that name. They owned the Morrison Building downtown, the Riverside office complex, the new commercial development on 5th Street. They were the biggest real estate company in the county, and he'd just spent 3 hours fixing a fence for their CEO like she was any other neighbor who needed help. The realization made his stomach twist with something he couldn't quite name. Embarrassment, maybe, or the uncomfortable feeling of having been evaluated without knowing it. That night, after Caleb went to bed, Raymond sat at his kitchen table with his laptop. He searched for Reed Enterprises, scrolled through page after page of commercial listings and development projects. The company owned 15 major buildings in downtown alone. Their portfolio was worth hundreds of millions. And Allison Reed, at 29 years old, ran all of it. The articles called her a prodigy, a visionary, someone who'd transformed her father's small construction company into a real estate empire. Yet she lived in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood, drove a car that was 5 years old, and stood on her porch in jeans, watching storms knock down her fence. Raymond closed the laptop and stared at the business card sitting on the table. She'd watched him work with those analytical eyes, asking questions that probed beyond surface competence. Why? What did a CEO worth millions want with a handyman who used to be an architect? The question followed him into restless sleep, and he woke Sunday morning with no answers, only a growing sense that something in his carefully controlled life was about to shift. The call came on Monday afternoon. Raymond was replacing a water heater in Building C of the Riverside Apartments when his phone rang. Allison's voice on the other end was professional, direct. Reed Enterprises was renovating an old office building downtown. They needed someone to consult on the project. Would he be interested in taking a look? Just a consultation, she emphasized. She'd pay him for his time. No commitment beyond that. Raymond's first instinct was to refuse. He didn't do consultations. He fixed things that broke. Pipes, electrical outlets, hinges. He didn't design buildings anymore. But something in her voice stopped him. Not pity, not charity. Just a straightforward business proposition. And the truth was, he needed the money. Caleb's school was organizing a field trip to the Science Museum next month, and the cost was more than Raymond had budgeted. So he said, yes, just a consultation, just once. Wednesday afternoon, Raymond stood in front of Reed Enterprises headquarters and felt his past rushing back. The building was modern glass and steel, 12 stories of commercial success rising above the old downtown district. Inside, the lobby gleamed with polished marble and contemporary art. The receptionist knew his name, directed him to the 11th floor with practiced courtesy. The elevator ride felt like ascending into a different world, one he'd left behind when he'd chosen diapers and daycare over drafting tables and deadlines. Allison met him at the elevator, transformed from the casual neighbor into a CEO in tailored business attire. But her eyes were the same, sharp, evaluating, seeing more than most people looked for. She led him through an open office space where young professionals worked at standing desks and collaborated in glass-walled conference rooms. Raymond felt out of place in his work boots and button-down shirt, carrying a folder with a few sketches he'd thrown together the night before. This was a mistake. He shouldn't have come. Then Allison took him to the Morrison building, and everything changed. The structure was a relic from the 1960s, 6 stories of concrete and brick that had been vacant for 5 years. But Raymond saw past the grime and neglect to the bones underneath. The building had character, history, potential. As Allison explained their vision, converted into modern office space while preserving its architectural heritage, his mind was already working. He walked through the empty floors, his fingers trailing along load-bearing walls, his eyes calculating ceiling heights and natural light angles. This building didn't need to be torn down. It needed someone who understood it. Without thinking, Raymond started talking. He described how they could remove certain interior walls to create open floor plans while maintaining structural integrity. He sketched on his notepad how they could add skylights to bring natural light into the core areas. He talked about green roofs and solar panels, about preserving the original brick facade while modernizing everything behind it. The words poured out of him, 3 years of suppressed passion breaking through like water through a cracked dam. He forgot about being a maintenance worker. He forgot about being careful. He was just an architect again, seeing possibilities where others saw problems. When he finally stopped talking, Allison was smiling, not the polite smile of a client humoring a contractor, but genuine interest. She asked technical questions that proved she understood exactly what he was proposing. They discussed load calculations and building codes, sustainability ratings, and historical preservation requirements. For 30 minutes, Raymond forgot everything except the joy of designing something beautiful. Then reality crashed back. He wasn't an architect anymore. He was a single father with a 7-year-old who needed him home for dinner. Allison walked him back to the building entrance. Before he could leave, she made her offer. Lead architect for the Morrison building renovation. Part-time schedule, flexible hours, work from home when possible. She'd adjust the project timeline to accommodate his needs. The salary she named was more than he'd earned in 2 years of maintenance work. Raymond's hands went cold. This wasn't a consultation. This was a job offer, a real one, the kind that could change everything. He asked why. Why him? Why now? Why someone who hadn't designed anything in 3 years? Allison's answer was simple. She'd watched him redesign her fence to withstand hurricane-force winds. Anyone who cared that much about details on a free favor would bring the same dedication to a multi-million-dollar project. She believed in his talent. She wanted him on her team. The words hit Raymond harder than he expected. No one had believed in him for a long time. He'd stopped believing in himself. But belief wasn't enough. Raymond had responsibilities. He had a son who needed stability, not a father chasing dreams that might fail. He thanked Allison politely and said he'd think about it. Then he drove home, picked up Caleb from after-school care, and tried to pretend his hands weren't shaking. That night, Caleb asked if he was okay. Raymond said yes, but the lie tasted bitter. He wasn't okay. He was terrified. Terrified of hoping again, of trying again, of failing where it would hurt most. The decision kept him awake for 3 nights. Every rational argument said no. He had a stable job, a predictable income, a life that worked. Architecture meant long hours, tight deadlines, stress that came home with him. It meant being the person who'd been too focused on work to notice his wife needed him to slow down. But another voice whispered beneath the fear. It asked what he was teaching Caleb by playing it safe. It reminded him that his wife had loved his passion for design, had encouraged him to dream bigger. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, he could be both, a good father and a fulfilled person. On Thursday afternoon, Raymond called Allison. His voice shook as he accepted her offer, with one condition: 3-month trial. If it didn't work, if he couldn't balance both worlds, they'd part ways professionally. Allison agreed immediately. "Welcome to Reed Enterprises," she said. Raymond hung up and sat in his truck for 10 minutes, wondering if he'd just made the best or worst decision of his life. Caleb's excited reaction that evening, "My daddy's an architect again," suggested it might be the former. The next Monday, Raymond attended his first board meeting. Allison introduced him to 5 senior executives who would oversee the Morrison Building project. Their faces ranged from skeptical to hostile. Philip Henderson, the chief financial officer, questioned Raymond's credentials immediately. 3 years out of practice, no recent projects, hired through personal connection rather than competitive bidding. The implications hung heavy in the air. Roger Blackwell, chief operating officer, wondered aloud if Reed Enterprises could afford to gamble millions on sentiment. Veronica Price, head of development, suggested they were taking unnecessary risks. Allison's response was firm. Raymond's portfolio from before spoke for itself. 2 state architecture awards, successful projects across 3 counties. Talent didn't disappear just because someone took time away. She believed in giving second chances to people who deserved them, but the board's message was clear. They'd be watching closely. Any mistake, any delay, and Raymond would be gone. He left that meeting understanding he wasn't just fighting for himself. Allison had put her credibility on the line for him. He couldn't let her down. The first month was harder than Raymond had imagined. He set up a home office in his spare bedroom, working after Caleb went to sleep and before he woke up. The development team seemed determined to make things difficult. Delayed responses to his requests, vague answers to technical questions, inconvenient scheduling for site visits. Small frustrations that added up to a clear message: they didn't want him there. Raymond responded by working harder, double-checking every calculation, perfecting every detail until his eyes burned with exhaustion. His preliminary design presentation was scheduled for 3 weeks after he started. Raymond practiced his pitch a dozen times, refining slides and renderings until they were flawless. The night before, he barely slept. The next morning, he drove to Reed Enterprises with his portfolio and a stomach full of anxiety. The boardroom was intimidating, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown, a massive conference table where 5 executives sat with crossed arms and skeptical expressions. Only Allison looked encouraging. Raymond presented his vision for Morrison Building. Heritage Reimagined, he called it. Preserve the character that made it special while transforming it for modern use. Green roof with native plants, solar panel arrays, restored brick facade. Open interior spaces flooded with natural light. Energy costs would drop 30%. The building would become a model for sustainable renovation. He spoke for 20 minutes, passion overriding nervousness, and when he finished, the room was silent. Roger broke the quiet first. "Too ambitious," he said. The green roof added significant expense. Philip questioned whether investors wanted restoration or contemporary design. They expected sleek and new, not old bones with modern plumbing. Veronica worried about the timeline. Could he deliver on such complex specifications? Only Allison defended the proposal, arguing that the design honored the building's history while meeting every modern need. The board voted 4-1 to request significant revisions. Raymond left, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. Allison caught him in the parking garage. "Don't change the core concept," she said. "Just refine the presentation, add cost-benefit analysis, show them the numbers." Raymond wanted to believe her, but doubt was creeping in. Maybe the board was right. Maybe he was thinking like an artist instead of a businessman. Maybe he'd been away too long to understand what clients actually wanted. Allison seemed to read his thoughts. "The best architecture is both art and business," she told him. "Don't lose what makes your work special just to please people who are scared of vision." Raymond spent 2 more weeks refining his proposal. He added detailed financial projections, market comparisons, sustainability return on investment calculations. The numbers supported everything he'd claimed. The building would pay for itself in energy savings within 7 years, increase property values in the surrounding area, attract premium tenants willing to pay for green-certified space. He practiced his presentation again, anticipating every objection. The second board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. Raymond was ready. Thursday afternoon, his phone rang. The school nurse. Caleb had a high fever and was asking for him. Raymond's heart stopped. He checked his watch. Board meeting in 18 hours. He'd been working toward this moment for 5 weeks. But the choice wasn't really a choice at all. He called Allison, told her he had to go. She didn't hesitate. "Go," she said. "Family first." She'd handle the board. Raymond drove to the school with his hands tight on the wheel. Professional disaster and parental crisis colliding in his chest. Caleb was burning up, his small body shaking with chills. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia, admitted him overnight for observation. Raymond sat beside the hospital bed, holding his son's hot hand, watching IV fluids drip into tiny veins. Nothing else mattered. Not the board meeting. Not the job. Not his fragile second chance at a career. Just this boy. This precious child who depended on him for everything. If that meant losing the Morrison building project, so be it. He'd made his choice 3 years ago, and he'd make it again every single time. Back at Reed Enterprises, Allison stood alone in the boardroom. The executives were merciless. Philip moved to terminate Raymond's contract immediately. "Unreliable," he said. Couldn't even show up to defend his own work. Veronica seconded the motion. Roger looked uncomfortable but didn't object. Allison refused. Her CEO authority protected Raymond. But Philip had done his homework. Company bylaws allowed a unanimous board vote to override CEO hiring decisions on contracts over 6 figures. He delivered an ultimatum. Fire Raymond Foster, or they'd call an emergency shareholder meeting to vote on her leadership. They were threatening her job. Allison didn't flinch. She displayed Raymond's design on the screen, walked through every detail he'd prepared. "This isn't just a renovation," she said. "It's a vision for what downtown could become. This man has more talent in his drafting hand than most architects develop in their entire careers." The board was unmoved. She continued. "Raymond Foster is a father first and an architect second. That's exactly why I hired him. Because he understands priorities, because he knows what actually matters. If you vote him out, you'll have to vote me out too. I won't lead a company that can't recognize real talent when it's sitting right in front of them." The tension in that room could have cut glass. Roger shifted uncomfortably. He'd known Allison's father, had watched her build this company from almost nothing. He voted to give Raymond one more chance. Veronica reluctantly agreed. One final presentation, 1 week from Friday. No excuses. If he failed, both Raymond and Allison were done. Philip smiled coldly. When this project collapsed, he'd finally have the leverage to push Allison out and take control himself. Allison gathered her things and left without another word. She drove straight to the hospital. Raymond was slumped in a chair beside Caleb's bed when Allison arrived. Surprise and guilt crossed his face immediately. He started apologizing before she even sat down. Allison cut him off. She told him about the board meeting, about the ultimatum, about the one final chance they had. Raymond's face went pale. "Your entire career is on the line because of me," he said. "You should fire me. You should protect yourself." Allison looked at sleeping Caleb, then back at Raymond. "I'm not firing you," she said quietly. "I'm fighting for you. Because someone once gave up fighting for themselves, and I watched them regret it for the rest of their life." Then she told him about her father. He'd been an architect too, talented and passionate about sustainable design before it was fashionable. When Allison's mother got sick, he'd left his firm to care for her. Spent 10 years as her full-time caregiver, watching his skills grow rusty, his contacts fade away. After she died, he tried to go back. But he was too old, too outdated. The architecture world had moved on without him. He'd built Reed Enterprises as a construction company instead, always wondering what might have been. His biggest regret wasn't leaving architecture. It was believing he couldn't do both. Believing he had to choose. "When I saw you fixing that fence," Allison said, "I saw my father. Someone with real talent doing work beneath their capability because life had knocked them down. I thought maybe I could help someone get the second chance he never got." Raymond felt tears burning behind his eyes. He'd spent 3 years convinced he had to sacrifice his dreams for his son's well-being. Now this woman was telling him the sacrifice itself might be the wrong lesson to teach. Maybe Caleb needed to see his father pursue passion, not surrender to fear. Maybe being fully alive made him a better father, not a worse one. 3 days later, Caleb was released from the hospital. The antibiotics had worked. Color was back in his cheeks, light back in his eyes. Raymond took him home and tucked him into his own bed, profoundly grateful for modern medicine and second chances. Caleb asked about the big building project. Raymond admitted he was scared. Scared of failing. Scared of proving the doubtful people right. Scared of letting down the one person who believed in him. Caleb's response was simple. "Mommy used to say, brave isn't not being scared. Brave is being scared and doing it anyway." 7 years old, and his son was wiser than he was. That night, Raymond pulled out his Morrison building designs. He'd been trying to prove something, to the board, to himself, to everyone who thought he wasn't good enough. Now he stopped trying to prove anything. He designed for the building itself, for what it could become, for the pure joy of creating something beautiful. The hours flew past. When dawn broke, Raymond had completely reimagined his approach. Not different, but better. Clearer. More confident. He wasn't an architect trying to get his career back. He was an architect doing what he was meant to do. The week passed in a blur of refinement and preparation. Raymond hired a rendering company to create stunning visualizations of his design. He built a physical model that showed exactly how the building would transform. He practiced his presentation until every word felt natural, every transition smooth. The night before the final board meeting, he kissed Caleb goodnight and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, excitement instead of fear. Win or lose, he was doing this right. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. Raymond dressed in his best suit, loaded his materials into his truck, and drove downtown. The Reed Enterprises building looked different today. Not intimidating, just tall. The elevator ride to 11 felt quick. Inside the boardroom, more people waited than before. Board members, yes, but also city council representatives and potential investors. This wasn't just a project review. This was a public proving ground. Raymond set up his presentation. connected his laptop, took a deep breath. Then he began. He didn't start with statistics or budgets. He started with a story, the story of Morrison Building, built in 1962 by a local businessman who believed downtown could thrive. Weathered decades of economic ups and downs, stood empty for 5 years while the city forgot its value. Until now. This building deserves ambition, Raymond said. It deserves someone who sees not what it is, but what it could become. Then he showed them. The renderings took their breath. Original brick facade cleaned and restored. Green roof gardens visible from the street. Interior spaces transformed into light-filled collaboration zones. He walked through the technical specifications, the energy efficiency calculations, the financial projections. This building would achieve LEED Platinum certification. It would reduce urban heat island effect. It would become a landmark that made people proud of their city. The cost was higher than traditional renovation, yes, but the value was immeasurable. The room was absolutely silent when he finished. Raymond's hands were steady, his voice was strong. He'd laid everything on the table. His vision, his passion, his soul. Now it was up to them. The city council representative stood first. "This is exactly what downtown needs," she said. "A building that honors our past while embracing our future." The lead investor nodded agreement. "The financial projections are solid. The environmental benefits add significant value." "We're in." Roger cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Foster. I was wrong about you. This work is exceptional." Veronica added her agreement. This design could win national awards. Even Philip, who'd fought hardest against him, had to concede. It's good work. Very good work. Allison said nothing, just smiled at Raymond with quiet pride. The vote was unanimous. Project approved. Raymond Foster was officially lead architect of the Morrison Building renovation. He'd done it. Against all odds, against all doubts, he'd proven he still had what it took. The weeks that followed blurred together in the best possible way. Raymond was officially appointed chief architect with a full salary, benefits, and a small team assigned to help him. The hostile resistance from the development team evaporated overnight. Veronica personally apologized for her initial skepticism. Roger invited him to lunch to discuss future projects. Even Philip was cordially professional. Raymond had earned his place through undeniable competence, and the company's culture shifted to accommodate him. More importantly, Raymond figured out how to balance both worlds. He developed a routine, mornings at Reed Enterprises, collaborating with engineers and contractors, making site visits, and reviewing progress. Afternoons were for Caleb, pick-up from school, homework help, dinner together. Evenings, after his son was asleep, Raymond would refine designs and prepare for the next day. Weekends were family time, sacred and protected. It wasn't easy, but it was working. He was present for his son and present for his work. He didn't have to choose. Caleb's pride was almost tangible. At school, he told everyone his daddy was designing the big building downtown. Other kids thought it was cool. His teacher mentioned how much Caleb's confidence had grown. Raymond realized something profound. By pursuing his own dreams, he was teaching his son that dreams mattered. That fear shouldn't stop you. That it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. The lesson was worth more than any salary. 6 months passed in intense, rewarding work. The Morrison Building transformation exceeded everyone's expectations. The green roof became a downtown attraction before construction even finished. Local news covered the sustainable features. Architecture magazines requested interviews. The building was becoming exactly what Raymond had envisioned. A landmark that proved old structures could be reimagined for modern needs without sacrificing their soul. Every day on the construction site felt like vindication. The grand opening arrived on a perfect Saturday in late spring. Downtown streets were closed for the celebration. City officials, business leaders, press, and curious community members gathered outside the Morrison building. The structure gleamed in the sunshine, original brick facade restored to its former glory, modern glass additions reflecting the sky, the green roof visible from the street like a crown of living plants. It was beautiful. It was everything Raymond had promised. The mayor spoke first, praising Reed Enterprises for investing in downtown revitalization. Allison gave a brief speech about sustainable development and historic preservation. Then she introduced Raymond. He stepped to the microphone with Caleb standing in the front row, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Emotion choked his throat. 6 months ago, he'd been a maintenance worker convinced his best years were behind him. Now he stood before hundreds of people, being honored for designing something that would outlast him. He found his voice. 6 months ago, I thought my career was over. I'd given up architecture to be a father, and I believed that was the only choice I had. Raymond looked down at Caleb. But my son taught me something important. You don't have to choose between who you are and who you need to be. He shifted his gaze to Allison. Someone believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. She saw potential I'd forgotten I had. This building isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who took a chance on second acts and unlikely comebacks. He concluded with words aimed at anyone listening who might need them. To everyone out there who thinks it's too late to try again, it's not. Your story isn't over until you decide it is. Circumstances might knock you down. Fear might make you play it safe. But talent doesn't expire. Dreams don't have deadlines. You just need one person to believe in you first, and then you have to believe in yourself. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. Raymond felt 3 years of grief and doubt finally release their grip on his chest. The State Architecture Council representative presented an award, the Sustainable Design Excellence Award for Outstanding Achievement in Historic Renovation and Environmental Innovation. Raymond accepted the plaque, shook hands, smiled for photos, but his eyes kept returning to Caleb, who was practically vibrating with excitement. Later, after the formal ceremony ended and the crowds thinned, Raymond and his son took the elevator to the building's roof garden. They stood among the native plants and solar panels, the city spreading out below them in every direction. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, then spoke. "Mommy would love this, Daddy. It's so pretty." Raymond knelt beside his son, eye level now. "I think she would too, buddy. I think she'd be happy that we're happy." It was the first time in 3 years he'd mentioned his wife without the words catching in his throat. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But alongside it now was peace, acceptance, the understanding that honoring her memory meant living fully, not hiding from life. Caleb asked why Miss Allison had believed in him. Raymond thought about it. Because she saw something in me that I'd forgotten was there. Like when you're sad, and I remind you that you're brave. His son's face lit with understanding. "Then I'm glad she fixed our fence," Raymond laughed. "Actually, buddy, I fixed her fence." Caleb shook his head with 7-year-old wisdom. "No, Daddy, she fixed yours." The metaphor was lost on the child, but Raymond understood perfectly. That fence had been the bridge between his old life and new one, a simple act of neighborly kindness that had changed everything. That evening, Raymond and Caleb visited Allison at her house. The fence still stood strong and straight, testament to over-engineering and attention to detail. Raymond touched the wood, remembering the afternoon he'd spent rebuilding it. "Where everything changed," he said quietly. Allison joined them in the yard. "Just a fence," she replied. "You did the hard part." Raymond disagreed. "You opened the door. I just had the courage to walk through it." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, where both their lives had transformed. 2 months after the Morrison building opening, Raymond sat in his office at Reed Enterprises on a Monday morning. His office? He still marveled at that. The space had his name on the door, a drafting table by the window, and shelves filling with architecture books and models. A knock interrupted his thoughts. A young woman entered, nervous energy radiating from her posture. She was here for the junior architect interview. Raymond glanced at her resume, and his chest tightened with recognition. A 3-year gap in her employment history. The explanation was brief: family caregiving responsibilities. He asked her to tell him about her design philosophy. Her entire demeanor changed. She lit up discussing sustainable architecture, adaptive reuse of historic buildings, the responsibility architects had to create spaces that improved lives. Raymond saw himself in her passion, in her fear that the gap made her worthless, in her desperate hope for a second chance. He asked when she could start. Her shock was visible. "Just like that?" she asked. "Just like that," he confirmed. "Everyone deserves someone who believes in them. Welcome to the team." After she left, Raymond checked his email. A message from an architecture student caught his attention. The subject line read, "Request for advice." The student explained she was a single parent considering dropping out of school. The demands were too much, the self-doubt too heavy. But she'd read about Raymond's story in a magazine article. His success gave her hope. Did he have any advice? Raymond stared at the screen for a long moment, then began typing. "Don't give up. Your circumstances don't define your potential. They shape your perspective, which can actually make you a better designer. Find one person who believes in you, a professor, a mentor, a friend. Then prove them right. And if you can't find that person, start by believing in yourself. I spent 3 years convinced I had to choose between being a good parent and having a career I loved. I was wrong. You can be both. It's not easy, but it's possible. Take it from someone who almost gave up and is grateful every day that someone wouldn't let him." Raymond read the message twice, then sent it. If his story could help even one person, everything he'd been through was worth it. Friday afternoon arrived with sunshine and the promise of a weekend. Raymond finished reviewing contractor reports, approved payment schedules, and saved his designs for Monday. At 3:30, he packed his bag and drove to Caleb's school. His son burst out of the classroom with his usual energy, talking non-stop about his day. They drove past the Morrison building, now fully occupied and thriving. Caleb pointed. "That's our building, Daddy." Raymond smiled, but corrected him gently. "That's everyone's building, buddy. We just helped it become what it was meant to be." They drove home through their neighborhood, past Allison's house with its perfectly maintained fence. Raymond thought about the chain of events that had started there. A storm, a fallen fence, a simple act of neighborly kindness. None of it had been planned. He hadn't set out to reclaim his career or prove anything to anyone. He'd just been trying to help. And somehow, that small choice had opened a door he'd thought was closed forever. Life was strange that way. The moments that changed everything often looked ordinary when they were happening. At home, Raymond made dinner, while Caleb did homework at the kitchen table. They ate together, talking about school and friends and the science project due next month. After dishes, they played a board game, then read together before bed. Raymond tucked his son in, kissed his forehead, and stood in the doorway watching him fall asleep. This was what mattered. This small person who trusted him completely. Everything else, the career, the awards, the recognition, was wonderful, but secondary. He was a father first. He'd never forget that again. But being a father first didn't mean being only a father. That was the lesson Allison had taught him. The truth Caleb had helped him understand. He could be devoted to his son and still pursue the work that made him feel alive. The two weren't mutually exclusive. They were complementary. Being fulfilled in his career made him more present as a parent. Having Caleb as his priority kept his career ambitions grounded in what truly mattered. The balance was delicate, but it was real. Later that night, Raymond sat at his home drafting table with blueprints spread before him. A new project, smaller than Morrison Building but equally important. Renovating the old community center where Caleb played basketball. The building was crumbling. The city had no budget. But Raymond was donating his design work. He sketched new layouts, energy-efficient systems, spaces that would serve the neighborhood for generations. His pencil moved across the paper with practiced confidence. This was who he was. Not a maintenance worker pretending, an architect, a father, a man who'd learned that the worst moments of life didn't have to define the rest of it. The Morrison Building stood downtown like a beacon, visible through Raymond's window. Lights glowed in the windows, where companies worked late, where careers were being built and lives were being lived. That building would be his legacy, the thing he'd created that would outlast him. But his real legacy was sleeping down the hall, a boy who'd learned that fear wasn't stronger than courage, that setbacks weren't the same as endings, that his father's love was constant even when life was uncertain. Raymond thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, grief-stricken, lost, convinced the best parts of himself had died with his wife. That man had been wrong. The best parts hadn't died. They'd just been sleeping, waiting for someone to believe they could wake up again. Allison Reed had been that someone. She'd seen past his circumstances to his potential, had risked her own career to give him a chance, had refused to accept his surrender to mediocrity, and in doing so, she'd given him back to himself. The business card she'd handed him that Saturday afternoon still sat on his desk, worn now from being carried in his wallet for months. Allison Reed, Chief Executive Officer, Reed Enterprises. Raymond picked it up, remembering the shock he'd felt when he'd first really read it. He'd been so focused on the title that he'd missed what mattered, not what she was, but who she was. A person who'd lost someone too, a person who understood regret, a person who decided to use her power to create chances for people who needed them. She'd saved him. And now, hiring that young woman with the employment gap, answering that student's email, he was learning to pay it forward. The fence. It always came back to the fence. Raymond had rebuilt it to help a neighbor. Allison had watched to evaluate an architect. The structure stood between their houses, a boundary that had become a bridge, repairs that had become a revelation. Raymond had gone there with a toolbox and good intentions. He'd left with a business card that would change his life. Such a small thing. Such enormous consequences. It reminded him that you never really knew which moments mattered until they were behind you. Every choice contained infinite possibilities. The clock showed nearly midnight. Raymond should sleep. Tomorrow was Saturday, and Caleb wanted to go to the park. But he stayed at his drafting table a while longer, pencil moving across paper, creating spaces where people would work and live and dream. This was prayer for him now. Not words, but design. Not supplication, but creation. Making the world more beautiful, one building at a time. Honoring the gift of a second chance by using it fully. Before bed, Raymond walked down the hall to check on Caleb one more time. His son slept peacefully, small chest rising and falling with easy breaths. The science textbook on his nightstand was bookmarked at a chapter about architecture. Caleb had checked it out from the library, wanting to understand his father's work. Raymond felt his throat tighten with love. This child had been his reason for everything. His reason to quit, his reason to stay safe, his reason to avoid risk, and ultimately, his reason to try again. Because what kind of father taught his son that dreams expired? That talent had a statute of limitations? That fear was stronger than hope? Raymond returned to his own room, set his alarm, and lay in the darkness thinking about fences and second chances and the strange, wonderful ways life unfolded when you had the courage to let it. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, he dreamed of buildings rising from empty lots, of structures that would stand for generations, of a future he'd once thought was lost but had found again. The dreams were good ones, the kind worth fighting for, the kind worth believing in, even when, especially when, it seemed impossible. Because impossible was just another word for not yet. And not yet meant there was still time, still hope, still possibility waiting just on the other side of fear, if you were brave enough to reach for it. Raymond was finally brave enough. His son had taught him that. A fence had shown him the way, and a woman who understood second chances had opened the door. The rest was up to him, and he would make it count.